Okay, we're going to go ahead and get this started. Hello, everyone. I am Jeff Martin. I am the Director of Communications and Public Affairs here at the American Anthropological Association. I am an older white male with graying brown hair and wearing black, thick-framed glasses, and I'm coming to you live from the confines of my bedroom. Um, Welcome to Building Careers in GIS, Geographic Information Systems, the last of an 8-part Pathways to Career webinar series that started way back in March and was brought to you by the AAA. It's interesting to note that we've actually gone through almost a full 2 months of this career webinar series, and it's been really popular. You can see the career webinars that took place, as well as other webinars, past, present, and future, on our website by clicking on the link, which I am going to send right now in the chat room. There we go. To make this more accessible, this webinar more accessible to everyone, we're providing closed captioning. For closed captioning, move your cursor to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see the icon at the bottom. Click on that and you should receive closed captioning. If you would like to ask your questions verbally or hop on video, please use the raised hand feature in the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen. And be sure to direct any access needs to Nell, our accessibility coordinator, listed as such in the chat. You'll find her there. Also, a reminder to please turn off your video and microphones unless speaking, as this will help increase our bandwidth. We're looking forward to this interesting topic right now, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. In the meantime, if you would utilize the chat rooms, you don't have to wait even till the end to post your question. Go ahead and post it in the chat room and put it as question : so we can see it, and then state your question. Other than that, though, I always say I love how we interact in the chat, especially anthropologists. And if you have information, go ahead and put it in the chat. I love how people say, oh, by the way, I tried this software and it really worked for me, or this was a solution that helped me. I love it when there's kind of a back and forth in the chat. So feel free to use that. Without any further ado, let me introduce Elizabeth Bridey.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Bridey. I'm a white woman with brown eyeglasses and short hair. And today I'm wearing a blue and red top. I am not in my alcove today. I'm in a living room and there is a picture behind me of a mountain scene. Next slide. So as you know, today we are talking about anthropologists building careers in GIS, Geographic Information Systems. We're excited to have two excellent speakers, Gideon Singer, who works at the Baltimore City Department of Public Works, and Kyle Jones, who works at Esri. As Jeff mentioned, we will have chat questions at the end of their presentations, but please feel free to put any questions or comments directly into the chat and we will do our best to get to all of them. In the event that we cannot get to every single question, don't worry. We have a way of managing this. We plan to write answers to all of the questions, including those that were answered verbally during the webinar. So the answers to all of the questions will be compiled and available for you on Communities in about a week's time. And also on Communities, you will see copies of the PowerPoint and the PDF file of the PowerPoint, the set of references and resources that we compiled related to GIS, which has some excellent links in there. And then finally, responses to all of your chat questions. So let's go ahead and get started. And our first speaker is Gideon Singer. Gideon.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, I'm Gideon Singer. I go by the pronouns he, him, and his. Today I'll be speaking to you about the career I'm building with anthropology and geographic information systems. Today I'm wearing a blue button-up shirt and black wireless earbuds. I'm in my office at home in Baltimore. I self-identify as a digital garbologist, which you'll hear a little bit more about later. But currently I'm employed for the City of Baltimore and the Department of Public Works and the Borough of Solid Waste and the Office of Support Services as an administrative analyst. The short of that is I work for the Department of Public Works for the City of Baltimore. Next slide, please. So I've asked myself this question. I finished my degree in anthropology, now what? Multiple times. The first time I asked it was sort of premeditated before I even decided to become an anthropologist or an anthropology major in undergrad. I asked myself this question because I was immediately drawn to anthropology, but wasn't sure what I would do with it or what I liked most about it. And so the first thing I noticed in my very first anthropology course was that I was really drawn to this Boasian notion of anthropology being a multi-field approach. At the beginning, I found myself partial to the physicality of archaeological fieldwork. In particular, I like the dirt wedged into my fingernails when I was excavating. Later, during grad school, I found a quote by an anthropologist named Michael Thompson that the social scientist who wishes to study rubbish must, at the very least, paddle in it. And that's sort of been a guiding through line in my work since undergrad through now is no matter what I'm researching, no matter who I'm working with or where I'm volunteering, whether it's digital or not, I always have this need to get my hands dirty and involved with the material culture side of things. So the picture on the left is an excavation unit that I helped excavate in the island of Dominica during a summer fieldwork experience with St. Mary's College in Maryland. That's where I gained a lot of experience in undergrad doing archaeological research, including historical research. And then the picture on the right is the Regional Waste Management Facility in Alice Springs, Australia, one of the places where I volunteered and did ethnographic field work for my PhD, which I completed last year. So throughout my work, you know, I was really encouraged not to just do one part of anthropology, but really I had faculty at my undergrad and graduate school telling me it's okay if you want to do little bits of everything. Let your work sort of, let your toolkit develop accordingly. But one of the things that I was really fortunate to be encouraged to do was to learn how to use GPS devices and geographic information systems to create site maps, to digitize historical maps and archival maps, and just to learn the basics of spatial statistics. In addition to a lot of trial and error after undergrad, I tried out these skills and learned what I did like and what I didn't like. I worked in CRM for a little bit, which is Cultural Resource Management as a field archaeologist. And I kept asking myself that now what question? Now what do I do that I have these skills? What kind of job do I want? Do I want something that's more practicing anthropology outside of academia, or do I want to teach? And I went down the path of practicing anthropology. Next slide, please. And one of the things that I did when I decided that I wanted to do more practitioner work was I looked at my skills that I already had in my toolkit and found that GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, might be a pretty valuable tool to keep enhancing in my toolkit as I moved forward. So what is GIS? Well, it's essentially a technology that enables tabular data to be combined with spatial data, which can then be mapped, analyzed, and used to help assess real-world problems. But this is a pretty vague description. Where do GIS practitioners actually work? Click the next animation, please. Well, GIS practitioners work pretty much everywhere nowadays. It has its roots more so in environmental services. And in fact, archaeologists were involved in the early days of GIS as a profession because archaeologists have been using GIS for mapping sites and performing landscape analysis for the last 30 to 40 years. Really, I think I found some work as far back as the 1980s for site modeling and things like that. But this slide is a non-exhaustive glimpse of the different sectors that rely or use GIS. And so already you can tell that there are a lot of different ways and places you could work as a GIS professional. But what's interesting about all these different anthropologists is anthropologists probably have a lot of interesting things to say just with their traditional anthropological toolkit in all of these fieldwork settings. One of the ones that I wanted to point out here that I've sort of interfaced with more recently is marketing and advertising and retail, which have been using GIS and human movement data to try to figure out who their customer bases are in real time and things like that. I wanted to draw attention to that because I think that that is a space that really needs anthropologists at the table. But if there's questions, I can expand on that more later. So for now, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, I self-identify as a digital garbologist. Most of my toolkit was inspired by archaeology and traditional garbology, which is the study of garbage. And one of the through lines through that is this need to triangulate information. So not just to rely on one aspect of your toolkit, but to really see how data and analysis generated from all of those can yield something that is more holistic and sort of more anthropological in that sense. So I spent my first year after finishing my ethnographic research on the management of electronic waste in Australia, working as a GIS specialist for a local consulting firm here in Baltimore. It was the first job that I found out of grad school, and I found it because I wanted to work as a practicing anthropologist, but there weren't too many job titles for, that just said practicing anthropologist who specializes in waste. And so what I did was I looked at where I wanted to live, I looked at the toolkit I wanted to develop, and then I found this job. And at this job, I had to learn new skills and add them into my toolkit. And so in addition to doing the ethnographic methods that I had already been doing, which is the picture on the left is a picture of me volunteering at that e-waste collection event in Australia, I had to learn how to visualize and convey information on maps in ways that I had never learned how to do that before. And so this middle slide is just an example of a map that I made more recently, looking at complex types of data. But what was surprising about this job is it also forced me to learn spatial data science and began learning how to code. And so if you could hit the next animation, please. One of the things that I ended up doing on this job was teaching myself how to use Python, which is a scripting language, to work with big data sets, specifically looking at text and narratives and things like that. This is something in my toolkit I had to learn outside of the normal work hours and outside of my hours finishing the PhD. And so one of the bits of advice that I give to people who might be a little bit concerned about having to learn Python or some sort of coding or automation language is just to pick a project that you want to geek out over and think would be really fun. And so the way that I taught myself Python was by turning the entire script of the television show Futurama into a series of word clouds depicting what each character was saying throughout the entire series. And that was just something I really enjoyed doing and ended up applying it to a GIS layer I made analyzing social media sentiment during the COVID pandemic and masking the shape of every response by the counties, the US counties those responses came from. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the key things I want to point out for people who might be thinking about developing a toolkit outside of the normal anthropological toolkit is Whether you're, doing GIS or coding or some other sort of cutting edge technology, digitizing your toolkit in that way doesn't have to mean giving up field work. And so after I did that job as a GIS specialist, I was able to take those skills I had learned throughout grad school, throughout that job, and apply them to this new job that I have with the city of Baltimore, where the expectation is I'm still going to be making maps and using GIS on a regular basis, but also pairing that with ethnographic methods and ride along interviews, participant observation and field notes. And so the map here on the right is based on a short field work excursion I did over the winter, looking at where dirty street and alley requests come from in the city of Baltimore, specifically in this one neighborhood where we were piloting solar compacting trash cans. And so we wanted to see if over time there was less litter and illegal dumping in the streets of this pilot area because we introduced these solar compacting cans. We're still finalizing that analysis, so I don't have an answer for you just yet. But that's okay. This shows the mix of field work and digital work that I was doing. And one more slide, please. Lastly, I think it's really important to make sure that when you're doing this type of work, to share your findings in illustrative ways. And so the social media sentiments data set that I had mentioned is on the bottom right. And for those who have a copy of this presentation, once it's published later, these are hyperlinks, so you can click on them to actually see the data layer that I made. And then the picture on the left is an example of a story map I made based on my PhD research in Alice Springs, Australia, called The Story of Our Electronics, which is an interactive presentation. And so these are here as examples of what you can do with GIS in a more traditional data science sense, and what you might be able to do with it in terms of making your ethnographic field work more accessible to the people you researched or whomever your audience may be. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gideon. And now we're going to turn to Kyle Jones. Kyle?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Gideon and Elizabeth. So hi, everybody, I'm Kyle Jones. I'm a white man with blue eyeglasses and long hair pulled up behind me. I'm also in my home office sitting at a desk with a bookshelf behind me. And my pronouns are he, him, and his. Next slide. So I currently work as the UX research lead at Esri, which is the company that makes the ArcGIS platform. And ArcGIS consists of a bunch of different software and apps and a bunch of other services for businesses and customers. But it's also one of the main tools used for GIS and a lot of other mapping and spatial analysis work. But back when I declared my major in anthropology in undergrad, if someone would have told me that I'd eventually be doing something called user experience research and design for a company that makes GIS software, I probably wouldn't have believed them because I didn't even know what GIS was or what user experience was at the time. But similar to what Gideon said, what drew me to anthropology was also the four-field approach, which meant that there were a lot of different possibilities for what you could study and how those methodologies and that knowledge could be applied. And for example, my own research projects in undergrad and in grad school explored how people created local music scenes. So that picture on the left was from doing some kind of collaborative media making with young people in Peru and trying to understand the popularization of hip hop there. And this was something that I was both personally and academically interested in. But as I was in my final years of grad school and finishing my dissertation, I became aware of opportunities in industry where I could apply these skills and experience. And this was how I discovered the field of UX, or user experience. And as I was learning about it, it seemed to me that this was a very natural extension of the methodologies and concepts I had already learned in my anthropological training, but applied to the creation of digital technologies. And I was also excited because once again, this dovetailed with another personal interest of mine. I've been somewhat of a computer nerd growing up. So it was in my last year of grad school where I took a graduate seminar on UX design and got involved with some students in this other department and led to some side projects. And between all these things, I was able to put together, I was able to develop some new skills and really learn the language of this new field of user experience and try to begin to figure out how I can translate what I already kind of knew and had learned from my anthropological training into this new domain. And through these different projects, I was able to build a small portfolio that I used to apply for jobs. And I ended up eventually coming to Esri after initially meeting some of the recruiters at an on-campus tech career fair. So yeah, it was not how I expected I would find a job, but eventually that's how it all worked out. So I started in Esri in 2016, and I was initially hired on to the design team that supports Esri's public-facing websites. And they were specifically looking for someone with a research background that could bolster their team's user research capabilities, but also someone who could do this kind of early stage UX design work of doing things like information architecture diagrams and wireframes and sketching out how a digital interaction would unfold for a particular group of people or in a particular setting. So in 2019, after working on all sorts of research and design projects for a few years, I transitioned to a new role that focused full time on further developing our UX research capabilities, and just recently have begun growing a dedicated UX research team. And this picture on the right is from a conference of ours a couple years ago. It's called our annual user conference, where we have a pretty large research lab set up to do small different kinds of studies with people that are attending the conference. I believe this one I'm helping facilitate a tree test, which is a way to test navigation structures in some kind of menu or interface. Next. So while Gideon works in a role practicing GIS to inform governmental services and decision making, I work in a role that helps create the technological tools that people like Gideon can use. So I really work at the crossroads of the GIS and tech industries. And so similar to many other industries and technologies over the last 15 years, maps and spatial data have really undergone both a digital and a mainstream transformation. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when digital mapping and spatial analysis were done only on powerful desktop computers with really hard to use software by trained experts, and most everyday people interacted with maps on paper. But now maps and all kinds of spatial data are everywhere and more accessible than before. So there's been this interesting expansion in companies creating different kinds of geospatial technologies. And these are geared towards kind of two main purposes or audiences, really. The first are spatial consumer products and services. Think about something like ride-sharing services like Uber or Lyft. These are essentially spatial services allowing you to figure out how to get from one place to another, or even something like Airbnb. It seems like just yesterday when Pokemon Go exploded and gamified public spaces, and people were going all over the place looking for Pokemon, and even maybe more traditional services like Yelp or TripAdvisor or weather apps or something like Zillow. These also prominently feature maps and incorporate different kinds of spatial information as part of what they offer people. Then there's the other side of practicing GIS or other professionals working in digital mapping or with other kinds of data. And Gideon's work is a prime example of this side of the spatial tech landscape. And he touched on many of the industries where this kind of work happens. And just to give another example, think about COVID information for the last year. How many maps and data visualizations and dashboards did you look at over the past year related to the pandemic? And behind all of those maps and dashboards and data visualizations were professionals that had to clean and organize and arrange that data that's behind that, as well as design those maps and interfaces and how people could view and interact with them. And then behind those people are people like me that create the technology that these GIS and other data professionals can use. Next slide. So what exactly do I do as a UX research lead? Much of my work falls into these four main buckets. First and foremost, and what immediately comes to mind is I carry out research projects and provide subject matter expertise within Esri. So I contribute to a variety of projects, design and development projects, by carrying out research that helps guide and inform certain design or development decisions. So I draw on, to do this, I draw on a variety of methods, even including things that are kind of more exploratory or open-ended in nature, like interviewing or ethnography or diary studies that really try to explore people's lived experiences and contexts. But I also learned and really enjoy using what's called evaluative methods. So things like usability testing or A/B testing or the tree testing I mentioned, which are geared to assess how well a particular interaction or interface is working. A lot of my time is also spent operationalizing our research practice. And what that means is basically making research easier and quicker and fairer and more rigorous. And this ranges from how we find, recruit, screen, and schedule and incentivize the people that participate in our research, as well as to things about how we store our research data and findings, and the policies outlining our research ethics and making sure that we're staying compliant with all the various new regulations and policies around data usage and rights to privacy and things like that, as well as managing our tools and research spaces. So overall, this is really geared towards improving actually how we go about doing research. And in my new role, I'm getting into all of the practicalities of running and growing a team, which includes hiring and mentoring, but also defining things like what are the specific roles and career paths for researchers here? What are our different team values and practices, or what do we stand for and how do we do our work? And making sure that I'm creating opportunities for our continued education and professional development. And lastly, through both cumulatively through my research practice as well as through specific initiatives, I also work to evolve our organizational norms and about how we understand users in their contexts and their relationships with our technologies. And this includes things like developing collaborative partnerships with other teams or departments, and working together on various projects, putting on how-to workshops or lunch and learns about how to take notes, how to analyze qualitative data, how to run a usability test, or how to find good participants for a study you're looking to do, on any number of topics like that, as well as fostering a community of practice of people doing these kind of research and testing work in our organization so that we can better communicate and learn from each other, as well as working to democratize our research tools and findings so that potentially anyone in the company can ask and answer questions about the things that they're making. Next slide. So in many ways, what I do is similar to other UX and digital research and design jobs. And since there's a lot of great resources out there about this already, including some from earlier in this webinar series, for my last slide, I wanted to highlight some of the common ground that I've found between anthropology and GIS based on my experience working with GIS professionals and helping build GIS tech. So the first being is the map is not the territory. And this is a really famous quote about how maps are abstractions and representations which only offer a partial view about a place. So both anthropologists and geospatial professionals, we both understand that the realities on the ground are much different and much more dynamic than can be applied by maps. And this is important because it reminds us that the feeling of certainty that we often get when with working with a certain data set or looking at a map, it can never tell us the whole story. And this also means that by researching why and how people make maps and other kinds of spatial data visualizations, we can begin to kind of dissect those and learn about the contexts that those are created in to begin to help people make better representations, make better maps and things about our world. And like Gideon mentioned, fieldwork is a really common component of a lot of GIS work. So this is a really, something that our disciplines share. And because we both recognize, again, the map's not the territory. What's actually happening on the ground isn't always the same as what our models can look like. So being familiar with the practicalities and considerations of arriving in a new place and getting your hands dirty and can go a long way in understanding how a lot of GIS work gets done. Data collection analysis, there's a lot of overlap in this area as well. And in addition to what Gideon shared about his toolkit and kind of maintaining a lot of those anthropological methods in his GIS work, I also wanted to add that we ask a lot of the same questions about our data and analysis, such as, what data are being collected and how? Whom specifically does the data represent? Who owns this data? What exactly does this data tell us and not tell us? Or in other words, what are the limitations of this? What approaches are being used to organize, triangulate, and interpret the data? What are the ethical, legal, or practical considerations surrounding the collection or use of the data? And so these are all similar ways of thinking, even though our methodologies don't always overlap. And what I found is that they really provide a common language between anthropology, GIS, and a whole lot of many other fields. And another thing getting touched on as well is storytelling. This is whether it's a map or an ethnography, we all take care in how we represent people and places. We're also faced with that common challenge of creating compelling narratives about people, things, and the complex processes and phenomena out in the world. And we also oftentimes have to communicate these to different audiences. Sometimes we're talking to other professionals like ourselves, and other times we're needing to communicate this to various stakeholders or the general public. And lastly, like anthropology, GIS is a discipline that encompasses many different domains and subfields, including the physical, historical, and sociocultural. So this means you can tie into GIS from a lot of different backgrounds and through lots of different methodologies, including many of those common to anthropology, like Gideon highlighted. And being familiar with this variety and being curious about adopting new approaches, it can go a long way in transferring skills and knowledge between these disciplines. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Great presentation for both of you. So at this point, we're going to go to the chat. And so all the attendees out there, if you have other questions, just go ahead and post them in the chat and we will do our best to get to them. So I think that I actually had the first couple of questions. It occurred to me as both of you were speaking that you both have PhDs. And I wondered, could the kind of work that either of you are doing be done by someone with a bachelor's degree or a master's degree? Kyle, you want to start?
Sure. And I would say definitely yes. We recently hired a UX user experience architect on our team who finished her bachelor's in anthropology, and she was spent most of her coursework doing in archaeology courses and field work, and then did kind of switch to kind of do an ethnographic study for her capstone, and then took a UX what is it called, like a boot camp kind of course after she graduated, and yeah, has been doing great work. So yeah, it's definitely possible to enter at different degrees into the UX field for sure.
And Gideon, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very possible with a bachelor's and master's to get work in GIS. But the one thing to keep in mind with more sort of GIS practitioner jobs as opposed to UX, and even my job, which isn't officially a GIS practitioner job, is that most GIS practitioner jobs, they tend to favor certifications in GIS quite a bit. So depending on if you're looking at getting a GIS analyst position, a bachelor's may be enough. But the sweet spot, from what I hear from my colleagues, is that certification between the bachelor's and master's level. The second part of that question was, how helpful is having the PhD to my current job? And it's very helpful. And so ethnographic field work was not a big part of my undergrad training. I mostly specialized in archaeology, and specializing in the ethnography of waste was really, really relevant to what I do now in the Department of Public Works. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think it's important to find what you're passionate about, whether it's music or you're a computer nerd or you just like hanging out at landfills. That's where having the PhD, actually, I'm all three of those things too. Kyle and I used to jam. But having that sort of notion of something you're passionate about, it works as a through line for your career later on, where, you know, just having the bachelor's or master's might not have given me the year of ethnographic experience I needed to really do the job that I'm doing now with the anthropological mindset that I have.
Okay, thank you. And Kyle, was that also your experience, that somehow that additional training for the PhD was useful to you in your current job, or not quite as important as Gideon was saying?
Yeah, I feel like it certainly is useful, especially when you have when you get into those conversations or you get questions from stakeholders about how do we know when to stop interviewing, or how many, or why isn't you're telling me we only interviewed 15 people? That's not statistically significant. So you quickly get into some of these conversations where having a little bit more of the kind of depth of training and knowledge that comes with a master's or a PhD can become really helpful in helping explain some of those things. And I think, like Gideon said, having more time and more opportunities for different kinds of research projects and longer and more in-depth research projects that come with graduate school can also be really beneficial. I mean, a lot of the work I do is are relatively shorter studies. But having that grounding really kind of, if you can do a 2-year multi-sited ethnography, you can do anything. So it gives you a strong foundation that, you know, you can adapt from as well. And like I said, having all those other research opportunities that comes with master's or a PhD program are beneficial as well.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, do you find that there is an understanding of the value and a demand within GIS fields for anthropological methods and research? Gideon, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think Kyle did a good job speaking to this with his slide on the overlap between anthropology and GIS. There's a broker between the two disciplines called cultural geography. And so I think a lot of folks who go through GIS training programs are exposed to a lot of the same ideas and lines of questioning that anthropology students get exposed to. And in my work, I think GIS professionals get most excited when they meet an anthropologist because they know anthropologists like to do field work. And GIS professionals very seldomly have the time to go out and ground truth their data. And so in my experience, there's quite a bit of an understanding, but the only hiccup is it's usually not those GIS analysts and senior GIS professionals that are doing the hiring. Usually it's HR. So I think there can be a bit of a misunderstanding in value and demand in the hiring sector. So anthropologists have to work a little bit harder to get into that GIS lane if they want to.
And Kyle, what about you?
I think in terms of the UX field, I would say now it's pretty common to see anthropology specifically called out as one of the fields that they're looking for some kind of degree or background in. But I think that is even different than when I was applying for jobs. When I was on the job market in 2015, 2016, when I was commonly asked, "What does anthropology have to do with user experience?" And so I feel like that. That kind of stage is large. I think a lot of people get it now about why and how it's relevant. Yeah, I think that but at the same time, user experience in similar to ways to GIS is people come to it from a lot of different backgrounds. There's fields like ergonomics and human factors engineering and human computer interaction, where this is long been where these kinds of professionals have traditionally come from for these kinds of roles. But there's been this kind of broadening of the scope of what UX research is, and seeing how lots of its methods and kind of approaches overlap with lots of other social science disciplines. So yeah, I think it's definitely kind of recognized as bringing something unique, especially looking at and seeing like resumes and portfolios coming through. The anthropological ones usually stand out are a little bit different, or at least I can at least probably tell, like, I bet this person has an anthropology background just by kind of looking at their portfolio. But yeah, I think it's definitely changed since I've started in the UX field.
Good. That's a good trend. Deborah has a question. What are some good resources for coding and analyzing qualitative data?
Yeah, I'm glad to recommend some books. There's some great kind of like textbook style resources out there that I still use in reference. Yeah, I'll make sure I add those to our resources list. But I also wanted to add that there's a lot of new, so kind of with this whole kind of rise of this field of user experience, there's been a bunch of new tools for qualitative data analysis that have sprung up recently. One of the main ones is called Dovetail, and it's really funny the kind of parallels between the rise in qualitative data analysis tools and these new kinds of mapping tools. They're really similar paths, but just different kinds of domains. But yeah, they're kind of geared towards these kind of more industry and professionals doing qualitative research in industry settings, as opposed to things like tools like MaxQDA or NVivo or Atlas TI that we learned in grad school that are kind of geared towards more this kind of academic and scientific research. And a lot of these, a lot of this kind of like media ecosystem around user experience work and tools and things like that has also given rise to a lot of new people explaining how to do qualitative data analysis and looking for themes in your data and how to organize and approach creating tags, or what they call tags, but what I learned is codes. They're called tags, and some of the languages is a little different, but a lot of the concepts are the same. So I'll be sure to include some links to those references, but there's definitely way more out there now than there used to be.
Great. And Gideon, how do you respond to resources for coding and analyzing qualitative data?
Yeah, well, I think Kyle has listed most of the ones that I'd recommend. The one rabbit hole that I've gone down that is pretty unique over the last year has been with using Python and scripting languages to pull qualitative data out. And so in addition to learning Python, there's a specific module that I think is pretty well used called NLTK. I believe it stands for Natural Language Tokenization or something. I can't remember the acronym, but if you Google Python and NLTK, you'll find that there's a lot of modules that have been written to process data from any website, from any script of your favorite TV show, any interview. Thank you. Yes. And so I recommend if that's something you're interested in, that's a pretty novel space, and companies are right now trying to make sense of what to do with all this qualitative data. And in my personal opinion, they desperately need anthropologists in the room to help interpret that data and the context around it.
Okay, great. And then continuing with the next question, how do you determine when you must be there in the field versus just using previously collected data?
This is Gideon. I'll take that one first. That is always the question. So I think we are always asking ourselves that, and sometimes having to backtrack. And so part of it relies on the quality of the metadata that went along with whatever was published. And so if you're reading about the data you want to use and you're doing your due diligence and research on it, sometimes that metadata, which is data about the data, is going to be really vague, and you're going to have to make a gut decision on whether or not you should use that data set or not, or whether you should go collect something and triangulate. This came up recently in my work. We're trying to figure out the rates of recycling participation in Baltimore City, and Esri has a data layer in their Living Atlas on recycling habits, but the metadata is not really descriptive of the limitations of that data set and whether it's relevant for the city of Baltimore. And so that's a scenario in which there was good metadata. I would read it, I would review it, and then think, well, what other data do I have to triangulate this? And how much of that data is available to me now versus how much could I collect in the field? And you're constantly weighing, you know, how much time do I have to do this? Who do I have to convince to go out and collect data or change how we collect data as an organization? And so that's not a answer to, you know, there's no one answer to that question, but the reality is it should always sort of be a dialogue, and you should always be digging into the metadata. And if it's not there, then finding ways to triangulate.
Right, and clearly cost and time considerations play a big role. Kyle, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, and I think for the and I agree with Gideon. It's something that you kind of always ask when you're kind of approaching a certain project. But for my kind of UX research work in particular, it often really depends on, you know, what are the kinds of questions that are being asked, and what do we already know, and more importantly, yeah, what kind of stage is this kind of, you know, design or you know, piece of software interface or interaction in, and what's the particular, you know, what's the particular focus? Again, going back to the questions, what are we trying to figure out? Are we trying to figure out how you know, GIS professionals go about doing their work, or are we trying to figure out how well this one particular, you know, workflow within the software is functioning with people? And so those are kind of different kinds of questions that require different methodologies. And I think it's to what the kind of crux of it is, to what extent does this larger context matter for the questions at hand, or for where the project is? And I think there's, but then again, even when you're doing some kind of a more evaluative kind of study, the context can still matter. And you have to, and that's where kind of knowing this kind of general context of, okay, the kind of people using this in general can kind of come into hand, because even if they do some kind of usability test or A/B test in a lab setting, or using some kind of demo computer or something like that, there's still maybe, you know, contextual factors that would be otherwise influencing how they would be using this technology that you wouldn't be able to understand. So yeah, I think it's always a constant kind of juggle of, you know, okay, how much of the context are we needing to understand, and again, what are the constraints, or where's this project at, and what can we do? I will say that, you know, similar with the kind of new kind of research tools and technology that's developed in the last 5 to 8 years, is that there's also a whole new host of ways to do remote research that has, you know, opened up a lot of doors, especially in the last year with COVID, and so many things going remote. And there's a lot of you know, traditional methodologies and participatory methodologies that can be used to understand this context as well. So for example, in my dissertation research, you heavily used photo voice, which is where you give cameras to people and ask them to take pictures of the things that are kind of relevant or important to their lives, or especially when I was looking at hip hop, what's kind of important to when you're kind of doing these kinds of activities. These same methods can be applied in user experience research. And so there's a lot of participatory and remote methods that can be used to kind of, in situations when in COVID, when you can't be there or when you don't have the time or budget and to go there either, there's also more ways to help understand that context.
Great response. Anna has a question. Is there a platform you would recommend for introductory level GIS training? Gideon?
I'll say it first before Kyle says it, because my recommendation is to use Esri's training. I basically am self-taught mostly with a lot of online resources from Esri, but there are also more open source ways to do GIS. And with Python especially, there are Python modules built for spatial data science. So there are a wealth of other technologies, but I promise I'm not in cahoots with Kyle. In my experience, Esri is the baseline for, like they kind of set the standard for making GIS accessible to the next generation. And their websites, I don't know who designed them, but they're really good for learning GIS. So
okay. Well, thank you very much. That's great. I think we'll go on to the next question. McKenna has a question. How do you suggest marketing yourself as an anthropologist for a position that involves the use of GIS technology? Or would you, in fact, market yourself as an anthropologist? Kyle?
So if particularly in the GIS field, I think Gideon would be able to answer that question better. But in terms of the UX field, I think again, because it's a very multi-disciplinary field, kind of marketing yourself as an anthropologist, it can often be limiting. So I often talk about myself as an applied social scientist or as a social researcher or something like that. That's a little bit broader. That kind of speaks to I come from this particular discipline that has these particular kind of approaches, but we speak the same language, and it's something that people can grasp onto, especially if they don't necessarily know, if they think they think anthropology still and think like dinosaur bones or something. So if the kind of position yourself in that kind of a little bit of a broader sense, I think is helpful.
Okay, and Gideon, you've got the last word.
Sure. I'm stubborn. I'm very stubborn. So I usually interject the fact that I'm an anthropologist in whatever thing that I'm doing, because I work hard to become an anthropologist and I'm always in the process of becoming an anthropologist. So that doesn't answer your question, but that gives you context. I guess my answer to that question though is particularly within GIS positions, what matters most is evidence that you know how to do what they're asking you to do. And so you can call yourself an anthropologist, you can call yourself a geographer, a social scientist, but what really matters there is that portfolio you build out for yourself. And so people can see what skills you have, that you understand the sort of core concepts in GIS. I got thrown for a loop because I got interviewed for a GIS job and somebody asked me a question about topology, and my mind just went blank because I was thinking about it from other non-GIS related perspectives. But it was just an example of they were testing me because I identified as an anthropologist. Can I speak the lingo with other GIS practitioners? And so maybe, I don't know if there's a good glossary guide out there for what GIS practitioners talk about. Maybe I should work on that. But I don't think it puts you at a disadvantage as long as right up there with your title, is a hyperlink to a portfolio of stuff you've worked on.
Right. Great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move to the summary. So the first summary comes from Gideon, and he has 3 key points. First, GIS offers new ways to understand and tell stories about place. Number 2, it's a portal into other skill sets that many employers find desirable. And number 3, this skill set may create opportunities to get back to the field in a way that complements anthropological fieldwork. Next slide. And Kyle's 3 summary points are, number 1, consider which part or parts of the GIS or geospatial industry in which you think you're interested. Number 2, seek out opportunities to develop skills relevant to those industries and roles. And number 3, discover and learn to talk about the threads that tie your training, interests, and career goals together. Next slide. So in terms of finalizing this webinar, we will be sending you a very short evaluation, and we hope that you will fill it out and email your responses back to us. As I mentioned earlier, see all of the postings that we have for you on the community's website. And then finally, I want to just thank the AAA staff for all of their work in helping to put together and see to completion this spring webinar series. This is the 8th in a series of 8 Thursday webinars. So thank you, Jeff Martin, Nell, Gabby, Scott, and Daniel for all of your efforts. I know that I appreciate all that you've done for us and for anthropology. And 2, I also want to thank Gideon and Kyle for their work today. It was a terrific seminar. I know I learned a lot. I expect that people that participated learned a lot too. And last slide. So that is the end of our spring webinar series. We hope to catch up with you again, perhaps in the fall. And thank you for spending an hour of your time with us this afternoon.